Sergey Radchenko is a Soviet-born Russian-British historian. He is Wilson E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs, John Hopkins School of Advanced International Study, and visiting professor at Cardiff University. He is an historian of the Cold War, mainly known for his work on Sino-Soviet relations and Soviet foreign policy. He also works on Russia and Chinese foreign and security policies and is a frequent contributor to Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, the Spectator, and other outlets. He has also produced some fantastic books, which come highly recommended, including the latest one, To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power, published in 2024. We will, of course, be putting links to those in the description of the video, and indeed, a lot of the questions in this conversation are based on his most recent study. Now, before we jump into it, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and just by sort of sharing, liking, and adding comments to the videos. All of these things help massively, but a huge thank you as well to those who've helped us to buy trucks this year through Cardiff Ukraine, and we are launching the summer campaign to buy more 4x4 vehicles that get converted into battle-ready vehicles, which of course help Ukraine remain resilient. Please do, if you are able to help out with that. Again, links will be added to the description of the video. Sergey, very much looking forward to this. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
Well, let's start with a comparison. So, you've written about the Kremlin's Cold War bid for global power. And I think it'd be interesting to put that into context because that seems to be a very conscious effort and a lot of resources, a lot of thought, a lot of effort went into trying to build that global power. Could we compare and contrast that to the US, which some people might sort of, find this a sort of curious description, but almost acting as a reluctant global policeman, almost as it fulfills that role on the geopolitical stage. There's always this internal resistance to that and a kind of pressure to withdraw. Do we see that same kind of psyche in the Kremlin, or do we only see it wanting to thrust outwards?
Well, the book that I've just published is a historical study of Soviet foreign policy, beginning from the origins of the Cold War and continuing throughout the Cold War until the very end of the Cold War. I also have an epilogue that tries to compare what happened during the Cold War with Putin's outlook on the world, so to speak. And that bid for global power that I describe in the book as a consistent feature of Soviet foreign policy, you could say that it was something that actually preceded the Soviet Union. There was always this desire to be recognized as a great power, not always going back, but centuries. But at some point, Imperial Russia acquired that desire to be recognized as a global power, and that continued through the Soviet experience, and it's something that remained even despite the collapse of the USSR on until our own day. So the desire for global recognition did not go away, and I highlight this basic consistency of Moscow's foreign policy. Now, some critics, having read the book, noted that I don't say all that much about American foreign policy and American ambition, American bid for global power, although between the lines, you can make the same argument about the United States, and you could say that through the Cold War, the United States also wanted to be recognized as the leader of the world, as the leader of the free world, and that desire for recognition outlived the Cold War indeed. 1991, or the period from 89 to 91, was that moment in American experience where the Americans, for the first time, really stood alone at the apex of global power and were actually recognized as the leader of the world. That unilateral moment that continued for a few years, and of course there were challengers, and they are presently challengers in countries, well, China and Russia, obviously the two main challengers to that sort of leadership. But I would argue that this desire for leadership, desire for being recognized as a leader is not something necessarily unique to Russia. Maybe the forms of this desire are unique to Russia because the Russians do have this almost, something like an obsession. They are constantly insecure about themselves. They want to be recognized because it adds to their sense of legitimacy of who they are. But it's not unique to Russians. I mean, the others, the Chinese, the Americans, other great powers also have that sort of desire for recognition.
And in eternal American discourse, we have this kind of tension, don't we, between that obvious role that the country is fulfilling, and those who are part of that system, either materially benefit from it or see their status as being, that global power. But there's this internal discourse of, wanting to withdraw in, the sort of isolationist tendency. I
Yeah.
wonder whether there is such a dialogue, such a debate during the period we're talking about in Russia.
In
Or
Russia, and I apologize for not directly answering the premise of your question. I did get it. I did get what you're driving at. Basically, the Americans have periods in their experience when they're turning, when they turn inwards. We had that period after the First World War, a period of isolationism. And by the way, after the Second World War, Joseph Stalin expected much the same to happen. He thought that the Americans would turn inwards and relinquish their role in Europe. Something that did not happen, by the way, and that contributed to events that we know as the Cold War, because the American vision after the Second World War was very different. No, they did not want to turn inwards. They wanted to stay engaged. They wanted to assert their leadership around the world and push back against Soviet expansionist designs, especially in Eastern Europe, but also, as we know, from 1950 onwards, also in East Asia. So that was very different from what the Soviets had expected, precisely because Stalin was thinking along the lines of, whoa, the Americans, they are not like that, right? They'll just turn inwards. They'll come back to their own continent. They'll come back to North America and not worry about the rest of the world. And now it seems that we're living through a similar period because there is something like that in the pronouncements of President Trump, who sees America really running its own sphere, so to speak, in the Western Hemisphere, right? So he's got interest in Canada, he's got interest in Greenland, he's got interest in Panama, but he perhaps doesn't have so much interest in what's happening in Ukraine, for example. So that sort of development is in some way a replay of some of the old scenarios of American foreign policy. Now, turning to the second part of your question, do the Russians ever feel that way, or is it that they're always driven towards asserting their influence far and beyond? And the answer is, well, the Russians are geographically in a slightly different situation. They don't have anywhere to withdraw to, unlike the Americans who have a Western hemisphere. So if they withdraw from Europe or if they disengage from the world, they can always just say, well, we're just going back to the Monroe Doctrine. Here we are in Western hemisphere, and that's it. We're happy with this. With the Russians, the Russians don't have that. They are surrounded on all sides by other great powers and great empires. Historically, in the East, they have China. They don't have anywhere to withdraw from there. Where are they going? Are they going to withdraw from Siberia? That's not viable. In Europe, that, of course, has been, Eastern Europe in particular, has been an area of long-term contestation, including by Russia, Russian imperial interests here. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is part of that. But what we saw in the early 1990s was perhaps, or the late 80s, early 1990s, the collapse of the USSR and certain retrenchment from not just from Central and Eastern Europe, i.e., Soviet withdrawal from its former satellites,
Central Asia, Soviet Central Asia, and other
dissolution
territories.
of
Yeah.
the Warsaw Pact, the withdrawal was some kind of withdrawal from Central Asia, obviously the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989. All of that represented forms of retrenchment. Remember, the Soviets also pulled back from far away theaters like Africa that were engaged in with all kinds of regimes in places like Ethiopia, for example. They were engaged in Southeast Asia with Vietnam, Socialist Cambodia. and Laos being their main allies. They're in Cuba, of course, as well. So there was a period of retrenchment, which I would say was caused more not really by ideological reorientation of any kind, but simply by material interests or the inability to sustain a far-flung empire. Once the back in the 80s, Mikhail Gorbachev realized that this was not something he could afford or the Soviet Union could afford. He started to curb those commitments, and that's why we had that retrenchment. And of course, the Soviet collapse itself accelerated this process because that's something that Moscow simply could not do. But once it recovered economically, that interest in projecting its influence far beyond its borders, not just in Eastern Europe, but also around the world, also in Africa, for example, in Latin America, that returned.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, Gorbachev is held up as something of a hero, certainly in the West. But what you're saying here is that this wasn't a conscious ideological decision to sort of decolonize, to withdraw or deconstruct this sort of imperial desire. It's more of a realization of weakness and the desire to not precipitate a greater collapse that if you try to sustain empire. And that has some interesting parallels to the present, doesn't it? Because what we see here is Putin's desire for imperial expansion quite possibly, and this is debatable, but quite possibly exceeding the material capabilities of the country to not just conquer those territories, but of course sustain those territories if they were ever to be conquered.
Well, that's right. It's a major problem. There was a few days ago, there was an interesting meeting of the Russian Council, what is it called? What's the English translation of that? The current Council for Defense and Foreign Policy, I think that's probably the correct translation, or the Council for Foreign and Defense Policy. They had their annual assembly, and although the assembly was closed, they produced a sort of a summary of the discussions. And one of the things that struck me there in that summary, I mean, we're talking here about the policy elites in Moscow, right? People the Lukyanovs, the Karaganovs, Lavrov was there, various, diplomats, etc. So it sort of reflects a general sense. It doesn't mean that they set the policy because the policy is set from above, but it's interesting to hear what they have to say. And so there was the summary where they noted how Ukraine would be a factor of instability for Russia no matter what happened for a long, long time. They, I think, understand that even if Putin managed to claw his way to something resembling a victory in Ukraine, the quote unquote pacification of the country would be a massive drain on Russian resources, just in the way that reconstruction, quote unquote, reconstruction of the areas that Russia has already annexed in eastern Ukraine has been a massive drain on resources. So, I mean, this is not surprising. Imperial projection always takes a lot of money and is rarely something that helps raise the standard of living of your core population. So I think with Russia, the Russians, of course, will give up a lot for the sake of their imperial ambitions. They're great suckers for greatness. They will love the sense of being seen as a great power, projecting their imperial strength far and wide, and they will give up a lot for that. But there's also a balance to be struck there. And one of the lessons of the Cold War was imperial overextension was something that did not reflect positively on the Soviet leadership from the standpoint of their own population. So we get into the 1980s, a period of stagnation, a period of starting from the 70s, obviously, a period of declining effectively standards of living. And yet the Soviet Union is involved in Afghanistan, fighting a war there. It's providing aid to Mongolia. It's providing aid to socialist Vietnam, etc. And there were actually discussions at the Politburo at that time, led by Gorbachev, saying, why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep doing this? This is a huge strain on our resources. Shouldn't we focus on our own country? And well, I don't expect those kind of conversations to take place right now in Putin's immediate circle because he's obviously preoccupied with imperial projection. But I think once Putin is out of the way, that debate will return.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is a refrain I heard a lot in the 90s when I was there. And this is St. Petersburg, which was relatively affluent, and constant complaints of, it was our empire. So why did people in, the GWR, why did people in the Baltics live so much better materially than we did? Surely, we could have fixed that. So already those resentments really sort of bubbling up there. Um, well, let's come back to that in a second, because it seems to me that there's something also interesting about these periods of less aggressive foreign policy from Russia. So in the US, in some ways it's unpredictable. It's based on which party, which policy, which leader comes to power, and to an extent driven by external events. But seems to be a certain pattern of when Russia is, let's say, a little less active in projecting this sort of imperial expansion, it tends to coincide with those periods of regime consolidation. Whether that be sort of, Stalin consolidating his regime, socialism in one country, it's all about really taking control of the reins of power and the material resources before you can project out. With Putin, the same. We had a relatively quiet period, apart from the Chechen wars. We had a relatively quiet period in the early 2000s as this consolidation process took place, as the erosion of civic institutions or their co-option for the regime was taking place. It's only when that process of consolidation is deemed to be safe that you start to get aggressive foreign policy. Is that too simplistic, or is there a real pattern there?
I think there is a pattern of a kind. Another example that you did not raise, but which is also very interesting, is the period immediately after Stalin's death, which may be relevant. Once Putin passes from the scene, we may find ourselves in a similar situation. But you had a period of collective leadership before Nikita Khrushchev consolidated his power, and what you saw is, in fact, some sort of a turn towards liberalism, and I have to be careful with the use of the term liberalism. It was not liberalism in the Western sense, but it was more liberal communism, so to speak. Well, okay, maybe I've stopped making sense. What I'm trying to say here is you have people being let out of the Gulag. This was actually policy pursued consciously by Lavrentiy Beria, one of Stalin's henchmen, in order to consolidate the popular support for his own bid to power. We also had a sort of weird Soviet attitude towards the whole German problem. For a while, the Soviets actually, and we're talking about the period in the summer of 1953, just a month after Stalin died, there was this idea that perhaps Germany should just give up on this, or East Germany should give up on the idea of building socialism. I talk about that in my book. It's fascinating. They ultimately turned away from that idea. And the Cold War continued as we know it. But of course, there was a period in the mid 1950s where the Soviet leaders really were trying to escape from what they perceived as isolation. They were reaching out to the West. There were meetings between Nikita Khrushchev and Eisenhower in Geneva in 1955 that sort of pointed in that direction. And then once Nikita Khrushchev consolidated his power, which happened really by 1957, of course, he was also now empowered by the knowledge that the Soviet Union had the thermonuclear weapons and the means of their delivery, which also gave him a degree of confidence. Then we see much more assertive foreign policy. We see things like the Berlin Ultimatum, November 1958. We see the Berlin Crisis, which thankfully did not end up in a direct superpower confrontation. Of course, most famously or infamously, we see the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Now, then you have a change of leadership from Khrushchev to Brezhnev. And there is are the Soviets more? This is a slightly different story, because at that time the Soviets for a time tried to be more revolutionary, because the Soviet leadership, Brezhnev and Kosygin, felt they did not have enough legitimacy domestically, and so they tried to win this legitimacy through their recognition by their allies around the world for their revolutionary spirit, which explains why they provided all that aid to Vietnam of course, during the escalation phase of the Vietnam War. But then you get into the period where Brezhnev actually consolidated his power. This is after 1968, 69. We get into the early 1970s, and Brezhnev actually feels that he's secure enough in power to a certain extent, and he launches into this project of detente with the West. So that actually flips the argument on its side. You know how it's always difficult with history. You try to look for patterns, and it turns out that actual patterns don't really work. So in one case, in the early 50s, you had an insecure leadership that tried to rebuild relations with the West because they didn't have the kind of legitimacy. And then in the early 70s, you have a much more secure Brezhnev who's already been in power for 6 or 7 years, who's now actually engaging in detente with the United States. So make of it what you will.
And not impossible to imagine that if Prigozhin's mutiny had succeeded, you may have had a period of that sort of internal consolidation in that instance as well. Who knows? I mean, a lot of other variables at play there, and Prigozhin was not part of the traditional elites, but
Absolutely.
it is
Absolutely. I
possible
mean
to imagine.
it's at that time Prigozhin was seen as something rather worse than Putin, deeply nationalistic and but these people are so opportunistic. We know they're opportunistic, right? So people like if Prigozhin came to power, which we have to agree was not a very high
A
likelihood.
high probability, but
Not a high
yeah.
probability of that happening, but suppose that were to come to pass, I would see. I would not discount the possibility that Prigozhin would immediately try to end the war in Ukraine and re-engage with the United States and Europe on some new basis, just like Beria tried to do after Stalin's death.
Yeah, not entirely conceivable. Alas, that didn't come to that at all. I'm interested as well here in, we think of where Russia ended up or where the Soviet Union ended up as kind of an inevitability, with Berlin carved up, with Germany sort of split in two. Um, but I think as you sort of, study more about that and realize that this imperial dynamic doesn't necessarily have a kind of a concrete line in the sand, but like the old sort of Lenin maxim, you keep pushing until you meet some kind of solid resistance with your bayonet. It's become an interesting question to me is not how, Russia came to dominate Eastern and Central Europe in that way, but what actually stopped their expansion further, and would they have been minded to go further if they hadn't met resistance. Coming back to what you said earlier, if the US had, entrenched and become isolationist, then Russia, aka the Soviet Union, may well have seen the entirety of Europe as its sphere of influence. And indeed, Putin seems to have actually fallen into that kind of mentality. Am I trying to draw too many parallels together here, or is it a useful question to ask,
It is.
why it was stopped?
It is a super useful question, extremely interesting question that doesn't have any clear answer. Let me demonstrate this with reference to Stalin. So we had in 1943, 44, 45, so in the years leading to the end of the Second World War, we had this internal Soviet debate about the shape of the post-war world. Special committees were organized inside of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. One of them was headed by uh, Maxim Litvinov, former foreign commissar, who was seen as an Anglophile and had kept a photo of President Roosevelt on his desk allegedly. And then the other committee was headed by Ivan Maisky, who was, of course, the very, very Anglophile ambassador in at the court of St. James in the UK in years prior. And so you would see this two kind of Anglophile pro-Western would not be the right sort of term here, but very interesting individuals leading these committees to discuss the post-war world. And you read their reports to Molotov, which were then passed up the food chain to Stalin, presumably, about what the Soviets could lay claim to. And they're pretty imperialistic, for all the Anglophilia. They basically talk about the Soviets taking advantage of the power vacuum in Europe and projecting way out there to control potentially having Sweden in their sphere of influence. The Soviets wanted a colony in North Africa. They wanted to control. I mean, they even at that stage they also had certain limits to their ambitions. So, for example, they did not think that the Soviets would be able to control France, for example, but they saw that France would be a weak state anyway, and it was actually in the Soviet interest to preserve that weakness and to preserve Germany, to keep Germany divided and to break it up into various small states. So you have these reports that show the extent of the Soviet ambition. Did Stalin share that? Difficult to say. Stalin was opportunistic. I think Kennan got that right in the long telegram. He also was very, very cautious. He was cautious. He was worried about getting the Soviet Union involved in another great war, in another confrontation. He was particularly worried later about American intervention in various wars in Asia, whether it was the Chinese Civil War that raged from 1946 to 1949, or the Korean War. And it was actually after he was convinced that the Americans would not intervene in the Korean War that well, before the Korean War started, that he gave the green light to Kim Il-sung to actually invade South Korea. So Stalin was a cautious operator. And it's not clear whether he had any sort of a big vision for dominating the world and turning it red, except in a kind of almost quasi-religious sense. At some point, this would happen. At some point, communism would triumph, and of course, Moscow would preside over that process, but it was not something that was immediately in the cards. Norman Naimark, one of the most prominent historians of Stalin's foreign policy, wrote a book about Stalin's approach to different post-war situations in Eastern Europe. He looked at Poland, he looked at Southeast Asia, at Finland, and as you can actually see from his study and also from looking at the archival documents, Stalin was different in his approach to different places. So he was not dogmatic in the sense that here's a list of what we have to do in every country. It's all the same. We just have to dominate, dominate, dominate. No, in some countries, he was willing to give up his control, as we know in Finland, for example. In some countries, he was willing, he was actually, no, he would hold on, but the way he would do that would be different from one case to another case. He put a lot of hope in this idea of coalition governments and so on and so forth, until all of that fell apart by 1947 approximately, and he changed his policy towards more brutal imposition of communism. All of which is to say that Stalin's foreign policy, even with all the access to documents that we have now, 80 years later, we still don't really know what his ultimate intentions were. But think about, if you're an American politician thinking, trying to figure out what to do in 1945, 46, 47, you don't know what Stalin's intentions are. And you also recognize that perhaps Stalin himself doesn't know what his intentions are, because as the French say, appetite comes while eating. So what you want to do then is to basically say, okay, you're not, we're going to push back. We're not going to give you an opportunity to expand, even if you didn't want to expand. But in case if you wanted, you're not going to have that because we're going to push back. So this is the policy of containment of Soviet ambitions. So that is very important. But you might argue then that, well, the containment fed into Soviet insecurity, and that is what brought on the Cold War. But I would ask, and for my part, well, what if you didn't do that? And you said, okay, well, please expand if you like, then actually Stalin would perhaps see opportunities that he would not have seen otherwise, and you would have seen Soviet domination of Europe. So we are basically in the same, projecting over to fast forward into where we are today. We're in a similar territory. There's a lot of discussion today about whether where the end of Putin's ambitions is. Is it in eastern Ukraine? Does he just want to control the territories that he has formally annexed? Does he want to control all of Ukraine? Does he want to invade the Baltics? Does he want to, I don't know, invade Moldova? Or does he want to go as far as Sweden and Northern Africa? We don't know. So the safest policy under those circumstances is not to assume that Putin has limited ambitions, because by assuming that and not doing anything would actually might encourage his ambitions to increase. Therefore, more sensible policies to push back and to resort to containment. And I think that's what the Europeans are doing, and that's probably sensible policy. I cannot say that this is not a sensible policy, but of course, we also have to accept the downside to this policy, and that is that it feeds this cycle of insecurity, and the Russians feel that all the things like, for example, Finland joining NATO that is directed against Russia, so they have to build up forces. We know all of that from IR theory. This is what happens. That's
I,
probably
I
something
find
that.
that idea interesting because it seems to me, from my sort of amateur psychology perspective, that actually it's that very act of putting up a steel wall, that very act of creating a barrier and showing the willingness. Maybe, insecurity is one aspect of it, but changing policy, forcing Russia to adapt, look at other horizons, other targets, that seems to be the result. Okay, you get arms races and all the rest of it, but actually they very much understand when someone pushes back with force and then will recalculate. So rather than that prompting some sort of paranoid, insecure reaction, that seems actually rather rational, even though the rationality is based on a pure equation of force.
Sure, sure. I mean, but once again, that's why I was talking about IR theory. We have people like Robert Jervis, for example, talking about, the perceptions and misperceptions, security dilemma when actions that are taken by one side are seen as offensive by the other, although they were intended as defensive. And so the cycle continues, and you might describe it as a tragic cycle because it may end up it's the best case scenario in the Cold War, and a worst case scenario in the nuclear Armageddon. But there are just no other better options to this, except of course to continue signaling to the other side that, look, what we're doing is actually a response to what you have been doing, and perhaps here are some potential ways to de-escalate the situation. And that is something we can actually. This is where the Cold War becomes very interesting and important, because you can go back to the Cold War. You can look at all of those instances, whether it's Berlin, 1961, whether it's Cuba, 1962, a whole range of situations where there was actually a dialogue despite the confrontation, and the two sides recognized that for all the tensions that they have, it was in their shared interest to step back. So that's the lesson that I think we can learn from history.
And I'm loath to sort of, project on Stalin anything that one might call rationality, but it seems from a description there and from his, as you say, willingness to suspend ideology in favor of let's say, a more realistic assessment of strength, weakness, and what's going on in the world. It seems that there's a rationality going on in Stalin's foreign policy and a sense of certain limitations, certain rules even. He does not seem minded to completely tear down or prevent the Western world order from emerging as it started to do in the 50s. Rather, it's, how do you not even coexist, but how do you exist alongside it without, succumbing to that? Putin seems to have a very different dynamic. I would say almost a far less rational one, one that seems to have far fewer limits. Now, of course, the fear is that that might translate into actual territorial acquisition, but that maybe misses the real point of what he's doing, which is corroding and corrupting international institutions, projecting a desire and intent to actually destroy that Western world order that has prevailed. It seems to be far, it doesn't seem to have the sort of the limits, the caution, the rationality perhaps one can ascribe to Stalin. In that way, it's in some ways it's scarier.
Well, I don't know. Let's back up a little bit and see here the parallels and the differences, so to speak. When we talk about the post-war world order, there's a lot of discussion of, Putin is now trying to undermine post-war world order. I would say actually post-war world order was the order of the Cold War. It was an order of confrontation. It was an order of spheres of influence, acknowledged or unacknowledged. So in many ways, we're actually returning to the post-war world order, not seeing some radical reorientation away from this. Stalin was a very cynical, brutal operator who would absolutely take advantage of any Western mistakes to score his to score victories for his policy agenda. Now, I argue in the book that he was still sometimes more interested in legitimate power than in just mindless pursuit of power. In other words, sometimes he would exchange. That's why he valued Yalta as a framework for recognition of the Soviet sphere of influence, and he was actually willing to pull back from some places as long as the Americans recognized the places that other places that would be legitimately under his sphere. So Stalin sort of recognized some limits there, and he valued that sort of legitimacy. Is there a parallel here to Putin? I think probably there is to a certain extent. I think Putin is also willing to go in that direction. When we talk about institutions and whether institutions are being dismantled by Putin or not, we have to be we have to be specific here about what sort of institutions we're talking about. Uh, there's a wonderful English um, realist called Hedley Bull, who had written about international anarchy as not being entirely anarchical, but certain rules exist. Actually, he argued in Hedley Bull, it's called English realism, that that put limits in the way of in the way of pure anarchy. And I think those limits, despite whatever Putin is doing or Xi Jinping is doing, still actually exist. And what sets those limits? First of all, the reality of the nuclear age. We have something called mutual assured destruction. Did this go away with the end of the Cold War? No, it remained, and it has been reasserted. And we've been talking about Putin using that nuclear rhetoric irresponsibly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that it's not even what Putin says. It's just the reality of Russia having nuclear weapons that actually sets the limits on what we can do about Russia. And that has been the case for the Biden administration, for the Trump administration. It's always been the case because we cannot overstep certain limits, and we have a dialogue as a result of that. We have a dialogue, and that's another interesting factor. Despite the breakdown in relations, despite the hostility, we know, for example, when in Ukraine, when we had this moment of nuclear scare in the fall of 2022, what did we have? We had direct telephone conversations between people like Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, and Sergei Shoigu, who was at that time the Minister of Defense, where the Americans expressed concerns and also sort of made some threats about the Soviet or the Russians, I'm sorry, using potentially tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The Chinese have also expressed concerns, which potentially played into that. All, that sort of back channel diplomacy, that dialogue, that is something that you might call this actually an institution of international politics that it actually is not in danger of being eroded. It's very much, the Russians actively participate in this. They understand that they have to do that because otherwise, we could end up in a nuclear war. So there are certain things that remain of that order, of the post-war order, and in particular of the nuclear order that was established in the 1950s with the nuclear revolution. So I wouldn't say that Putin is trying to dismantle all aspects of international order. I think he's very happy about reinforcing certain aspects which benefit Russia, but which have existed for decades.
And the evidence of electoral interference, is this more a factor of capability, the fact that in the digital age you can outsource certain operations, the GRU, you can outsource sabotage, threat, etc., in a way that you physically couldn't in the absence of the internet. The same with large-scale media and electoral manipulation. Is
Mm.
this just a translation of traditional behaviors into modern Russia? Or can we make a distinction and say that Putin has a particular form of intrusive aggression here in the use of these technologies? And of course, realistically, as these technologies develop, I think we're going to see an exponential increase, actually, rather than decrease in this kind of active measures, digital active measures.
I think a lot of this is new, and this is where I think quantity turns into quality, we have seen something of a qualitative change as far as, the use of this kind of active measures. It's not like the Soviets did not have this kind of active measures. They had efforts to. There were also fake things like the Soviets would put out, like the Tanaka Memorandum, if you remember that, that the document about Japan's effort to take over the world. Very
Were quite
fake.
effective at the time.
Yeah, it was very effective. I mean, so they would do this kind of things, right? Historically, it's not a new thing for the Soviet security or the Russian security services to produce fake documents to try to confuse people. My one of my favorite examples, and I love to to cite this. There was a moment in the early 1960s. I can't remember. I think it was 1964 actually, where a guy called Cyrus Eaton. It was a kind of a Canadian American investment, entrepreneur, banker, etc., who was behind the Pugwash conferences, traveled to the Soviet Union, met with Nikita Khrushchev, and he said, "Hey, I've got an idea. Give me some money, and I will buy the New York Times for you. And then, I will control it you can basically use that as a way to influence American public opinion." And Khrushchev was like, okay. Khrushchev did not quite react to that. It was obviously a crazy idea that this guy, Cyrus Eaton, had, put out. Very treasonous, obviously, but you can see the thinking that, yeah, media matters and you could influence public opinion. Of course, the KGB was famous for trying to do that. I think what has changed with Putin is the technology and the ability to do that. We also try to do the other way, right? It's not like it's a one-way thing. Just the Russians are trying to do to us. We're also trying to do to the Russians by debunking disinformation, or maybe even creating our own disinformation, etc., to confuse the Russians. And this is part of the new reality. And then we have special operations like the ones by GRU trying to kill people in Europe. Is that something new? Well, throughout the Cold War, we had people being killed in Europe by the Soviet security services. Not super new, but I think it is easier now because of the new technologies that are available. The potential extent of this operations is potentially much greater than it could be during the Cold War. And the one thing about Putin that is really different from the Soviet experience, Putin is not afraid of using this kind of information warfare. And also, I mean, here's an interesting parallel for you. During the Cold War, the Soviets were trying to jam Western radio stations. They jammed, I mean, you know that very well. They jammed Western, there would be like KGB reports on a yearly basis about them being able to jam.
Radio Liberty, all this kind of
Yeah,
stuff, which
and how,
at
people.
at a stroke, Trump has neutralized,
Well, Trump, yeah, well, that's a whole another story. But interestingly, today in Russia, I mean, they are starting to change because they have been trying to slow down services like YouTube, etc. But the general Russian regime's approach to information has been different in the sense that they, instead of trying to ban all the external information. They basically try to say, "Hey, we have our own truth. Here it is. This is what the West says, but we have, this is not this is a relative truth, but we have another relative truth. So select among this and see what you like." And in that situation, people end up selecting what they're more comfortable with, i.e., the Russian quote unquote truth. We have seen that done in the Ukraine case, that brainwashing that goes on of the Russian populace and where people just embrace the sort of state narratives. It's not like the other narratives are not available. You could actually read the New York Times from Russia if you wanted to. If you could, now with automatic translation, you could even translate it. But people don't want to do that. It's available, but they don't want to do that, right? Because they feel much more comfortable in their own bubble, in their own echo chamber. Now, is that a uniquely Russian phenomenon? I should be the first to say that it is not a uniquely Russian phenomenon. Just look at where we are with our social media echo chambers and bubbles in the West. You will see that people just like to, they choose the information that they like. That makes them feel good about themselves. But the Russian state has been able to instrumentalize it and weaponize it in a way that has not been done before.
And there's an interesting point there, isn't there? Probably the subject of a whole other conversation, but there are plenty of diaspora voices like Michael Naki, Plushev, and many others who are giving, that more realistic version because that version comes with strings attached. That is a sense of culpability, a sense of responsibility. Shouldn't
You
people,
don't want that, right? You
you
want
don't
to
want that. You don't want
good. You want
the
to feel
pain
good
of
about your
choice.
country. Yeah, you want
Yes.
to feel, you want to hear the kind of news that makes you feel proud and good. Oh, Russia, it's such a good actor. It's, trying to stand up from its knees, as President Putin says, and, et cetera, et cetera. So people just willingly buy into this. They're not willing to face the reality of what they're doing unless this reality just falls on them like a brick. And that has not happened so far because Putin has been able to find this war in Ukraine at a relatively low cost to the majority of Russians. Yes, the cost is there, but it's relatively low.
Or you want information that acts like an anesthetic so that you
Yeah.
you
Oh, yeah.
forget the pain and can just sort of carry on with your relatively in some cases miserable existences. Um, we've only got sort of time really for one more question. I've got a whole ream and ream of questions we need to get to, but I wanted to draw this interesting distinction, if such a distinction exists, and that is that the Soviet Union, even at periods of extreme personal power, as exercised by Stalin in his latter years, it still seems that their, foreign policy decisions had an element of decisions being made as an entity, as a collective, um, and in some ways reflective of perhaps what is thought to be the interests of the country, the ideology that the country espouses. At this point, do you see traces of similar sort of collective or elite thinking or input? Or is foreign policy far more the projection of personal power? And I have to say, individual malice as well through the person of Vladimir Putin.
I think it's the latter. I think it's very, very clearly the latter. If you go back to the period right before the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I was in Moscow at that time talking to folks, and no, but everybody basically thought that it was not going to happen. I've been talking about the foreign policy elites. That's some kind of a bluff. No, it's not in our interest. And
Opposition, none of the opposition thought a full-scale war was in the offing
Abs absolutely. Why is that? Because it did not seem rational. It did not seem like something that, even if you're a Russian державник, you were interested in Russian, state power, you would think, well, that's not the right way to do it. You just, you sell more gas to the Europeans so that they become completely dependent, and this is how you project your power. That's just so much more rational. And so that just shows how A, they didn't have any impact on the actual decision making, and B, how they ultimately, of course, had to readjust once those decisions were made by Putin alone. But that sort of concentration of power in the mind in the hands of one man, that's actually uh, quite quite rare in modern Russian Soviet history, with some exceptions. So yes, under Stalin, especially late Stalin, Stalin made policy. There's no reason to say that Molotov had, as foreign commissar, foreign minister, had any impact. I mean, he provided information. They had some, discussions in the circle, but basically Stalin said, and this is how it would be done. But then you had also a period of collective discussions, collective deliberations, whether under Khrushchev, until, of course, Khrushchev totally consolidated his hold on power, which happened, as I mentioned, by 1957. Then Khrushchev started doing very, rash things that nobody could speak up, or very few people spoke up against. Like, for example, his decision in 1962 to send missiles to Cuba. This was Khrushchev's decision. It's not like they had a reasonable debate. When they had a debate, they actually had a debate, but it was not. It was everybody saying, "Oh, Nikita Sergeyevich, you're such a wise leader, etc." Only one person, Anastas Mikoyan, spoke up against this, or at least not even against it, but just raised some doubts about it. So that shows that once you have sort of concentration of power, consolidation of power in the hands of one man, then you could have this kind of, then it becomes much more difficult for anybody to disagree with the decision making. After Khrushchev's ouster in the sort of mid to late 1960s, there was actually a lot of deliberation in the Soviet leadership, and you can see that from Politburo records. They had Politburo members and candidate members, and you had a lot of deliberate, a lot of discussion. And Brezhnev by no means actually was trying to impose his view. He was actually a consensus builder in many ways. Although some initiatives, like the approach to the United States, detente, a lot of that was actually Brezhnev's personal ideas. And then when Brezhnev declined, his health declined in the late 1970s, early 80s, again, the Soviet policymaking acquired something of a collective kind of nature, because the main decider, as George Bush would call it, the decider was not deciding. He was mentally not there. And then you again had a lot of, with the change of leadership, you have Andropov, you have Chernenko, you have Gorbachev. You look into early Gorbachev, you see a lot of deliberation of the kind that you cannot imagine today, just absolutely cannot imagine under Putin. So in many ways, this sort of dictatorial approach to policy that we see with Putin is pretty unique, although of course Russian history is very long, and I'm sure if you go back to like Peter the Great or Catherine the Great, you'll find periods where Russian tsars were pretty dictatorial, and Stalin, of course, Stalin was, except for the early period in power, Stalin was pretty dictatorial. But broadly speaking, I would say this is unique and this is very bad.
And this is where personal prejudices, personal malice, and certainly Putin seems to have some animus against Ukraine, not just perhaps the collective fear of the elite that Ukrainian values, the democratization, the move towards the West is inherently threatening to the Russian business model, the vertical of power. But you seem to have some sort of real personal prejudice and malice really coming to the fore.
Yeah, and and this matters. This matters so much. The personal disposition and personal malice or lack of malice, and I'll contradict myself a little bit. I said, Soviets were so deliberating, and sometimes actually was good for policy. Sometimes it was not so good for policy. But if you think about Mikhail Gorbachev, once he consolidated his power and he actually pursued engagement with the United States, even despite the fact there were some actually voices on the Politburo who were against that, right? They thought that this was betrayal of Soviet principles, etc. But because he thought that for him this was a good thing to do, he felt his personal disposition actually mattered in this case, and because of the centralization of Soviet decision making, Soviet policy, he was able to ultimately impose his, despite the discussion in the Politburo, he was able to impose his line, and the rest of history, the winding down of the Cold War, etc. But this is because of his personal outlook. And when you see a completely different personal outlook like Putin, a very malicious sort of view of the, very dark view of the world, then you have a very different output of the different policies as a result of that. And there's simply no control from anybody else in the leadership.
Gorbachev certainly seems to be something of an aberration in hindsight, compared to many of the other leaders through
Yeah.
Russian history. Well, I've got a million more questions, but we are out of time, unfortunately. Sergey, it's been a huge, huge pleasure speaking to you, and obviously an honor as well. You are one of the most prominent historians in this area, and it's fantastic to be able to have such a conversation and bring it to the audience, the channel. Thank you so much.
Jonathan, thank you for having me. Very happy to talk about history and the present as well. And in Russia's case, history is the present.
Yes, much much more so in some ways than in Britain. But thank you so much.
All right.